I'm Kai Bennett, and this is
Ariana Brown.
And we are What's Left. What is left, Ari?
Oh, well, today it's 9/11, and that's what's left.
9/11.
So I feel like 9/11 is something that, as an American, like, you have to have some sort of interaction with. You know, I feel like everybody remembers where they were at the time. Like, I was in middle school, and this was before kids had cell phones in middle school, and within like an hour, the entire school was having rumors about, oh my gosh, they're going to hit Chicago next, and like, we had no access to any kind of information. Like, there's just mad paranoia just sweeping the school.
Yeah, I was honestly skipping school during 9/11. I remember I was at home, and I thought it was actually the bombing of, was that like 97 or something? I can't remember exactly when it was, but there was a bombing, and I thought they were just replaying it until we saw the second plane hit the second tower, and then we realized, well, me and my other friend, we realized that it was new and everything, and just kind of kept up with the news like everybody else, I think. We both know what Bush was doing.
Right? Okay, so one thing I'd really like to talk about is how there's still not a consensus on, like, the fact that 9/11 is not explained ever. You know, I mean, the Secret Service, their whole function is to protect the president. So if they were in a situation where, I don't know, a foreign entity is attacking our country, the first thing that they would do would be to take the president out of the place that was publicly announced, like, hey, he's going to be here, into somewhere secure. Like, they have, for example, Air Force One that can be in the sky permanently, pretty much, because they can refuel it in the air. And it just doesn't make sense to have him somewhere that they knew, that everyone knew he was there.
So what's that imply?
I mean, obviously, you know, there's just a lot of things that aren't explained, and it makes it seem like he wasn't concerned about what was going on. He wasn't scared for himself and his safety, and that implies that he understood, like, what was happening. I mean, the other big thing was World Trade Center 7, which nobody really talks about or knows about, and it's like, okay, so there's the two Twin Towers, the giant buildings, everybody saw what happened there. But then at 5 p.m. that day, there was a 47-story building in the same complex that was demolished. It had a couple of fires in it. It was completely structurally sound. It was fine. Like, there wasn't rubble on it. Obviously, it was standing until 5 p.m. and actually reported a couple of times early that it had fallen. And so it's like, okay, so maybe this was a controlled demolition. They saw, like, okay, we obviously are going to have to start from scratch here if we're going to be building a World Trade Center complex again. But the thing about it being a controlled demolition is that it takes weeks to set up a controlled demolition, which once again applies foresight and foreknowledge. And then there's things like NORAD that can track. I mean, since the Cold War, we've been very concerned as a nation with tracking what aircrafts are going where. It's something that we're actually really good at. Ask Russia. But in this case, they were running a training program that was the exact same scenario as what was actually happening, once again implying foreknowledge, and that information got to those people from authority figures. It wasn't that they were hacked and that this was an enemy coming in and presenting this information. It was from the top down, you know, this is what we're doing today, this training mission that happens to actually be happening also.
What do you think really about, like, all the, I mean, because there's a lot of wild stuff going on with, like, whether it was an inside job or if it wasn't, or just, like, who to trust, whose story to trust, basically, I guess, about what's going on. Do you think that, like, the public sometimes takes a lot of that information, though, and runs with it, and maybe, like, draws some conclusions that aren't necessarily true, but are just, like, possibilities? And because, you know, it's so much easier to fall into conspiracy than it is to fall into fact, because, you know, it takes a lot more work to run into facts than it does to, like, just take these few bits of information and connect them. But and I know there's more than a few bits of information that, like, a lot of people use, but it just seems that if the government was going to be involved, or I know that's not necessarily, like, what you're pointing at, but if it was going to be like an inside job or whatever, it seems like there's easier ways to inspire the public to like
Comply.
go to war and comply or whatever than to like blow up 2 planes filled with people and everything. And I mean, I do know about the false flag. What do they call them? Like these, where basically a government attacks their people.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was instances in Italy where the United States government was funding people specifically, I believe, like from the Middle East to do bombings in Italy and say they were communists in order to like make people like anti-communist at that point in time. And I know people have done things like that and governments have done things like that. It just seems like a bit far that like what we have to do is run 2 planes full of people into buildings, you know?
I mean, I definitely agree with that. You know, and I mean, at the time, like, I was in middle school, I was a little kid, and it was just kind of all shock and terror and, oh my gosh, everything that I thought was safe and knowable isn't what I thought it was.
Yeah.
You know, but as I've grown up, like, you see who benefited from that. Like, it obviously was not the American people. You know, what followed this? Like, and it's kind of ridiculous to see how, like, to look back and see how quickly, you know, things like the Patriot Act were implemented and pretty much forced on this public that was, like, trying to deal with a huge loss, you know? And it's just so sad to, like, because, like, one thing I remember was there were just flags everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the whole country was just dripping in flags, and you didn't. Like,
I hate to say it too, but it was such false patriotism. Like, most of the people were just scared. In my view, most of the people were just scared. They realized that their home team just won. They needed their home team to win, and they pull up the flag. Because most of the people, like, you even talk to people, sometimes they don't even know why they're patriots. Like, it's just like, because we're free. Or
well,
something.
I mean, but even, like, even internationally, like, there was a whole lot of support because,
Yeah.
it was a really horrific thing to watch people
Definitely.
jumping out of buildings.
Definitely.
And, you know, just watching people flee from a dust cloud. And it was, like, I feel like there was a genuine patriotism that wasn't based on, like, oh, we're the best country ever, but it was based on, like, we just went through this together. We just went through this huge emotional upheaval, like, and we have to rely on each other to get to a better place in the future. And I think that's where, like, the story gets really sad, is that instead of, you know, coming together and, you know, realizing more of our shared values, we kind of pretty much decided that Islam is evil and we should kill those brown people. and then like everything else was just written off.
Yeah, it was I guess the best way to put it rather than false would be like blind patriotism. Like, because it was just this rooting for the home team is what I saw for people. We have enemies, we live here, we're rooting for this team, rather than like really understanding like why the towers were hit in the first place. Mm-hmm. Like, people don't hijack planes and run them into buildings without at least feeling they have a good reason.
Absolutely.
You know, and I mean, it's not like, the patriotism to me was just like, I mean, it almost reminded me of like gang violence. The way that it's like, you struck me, time to strike back, guys. We got our flag. We got, you know. So, I mean, like, maybe I shouldn't meant like, I didn't mean necessarily like false, like people were like pretending to be patriotic. I mean, I believe that they were sincere, but it wasn't like love of the country. It was more like hatred of the enemy.
Yeah.
And the enemy was brown people with turbans.
Yeah. I just think it's really, really sad that, I mean, there are people that are being indefinitely detained in the name of our country, and, you know, we pretty much said, you know, they don't have rights. They're not really people. Like, they can just sit in Guantanamo Bay until we find something else to do. And yeah, it's okay to torture them and waterboard them and electrocute them. And I don't think that, I mean, I think that like the initial reaction for most Americans, like, there was a lot of anger, but I don't think that there was the kind of hatred that leads you to torture a person for a decade.
No, yeah. That's because that's institutionalized anger there. Institutionalized anger works by numbers and not by like emotional qualities. But yeah, it's really interesting, the reaction. And then like, I mean, still to this day, even after like 11 years after that, we still have like the same tactics being used throughout the globe.
11 years later.
And I mean, it makes things really difficult, because it's like, on one hand, I mean, you're an American, you live here, and I mean, you...
Everyone you know is an American for the most part.
Everyone, for the most part...
Your family.
Yeah, are all Americans, but at the same time, like, sometimes I feel like more camaraderie with, like, some of the basic people that I see whose houses have been blown up by American bombs than I do with some of my, like, compatriots here in my own nation. So, I mean, and that's just because, like, I mean, I've always sided, you know, with people that struggle in things and have these issues with oppression or exploitation. But, like, throughout the globe, seeing other people go through that, and it's like my tax dollars are like what built that bomb that's going into that person's house that I have more in common with than half the people live in my country.
And I was in a political science class today, and I was the only person that knew the number of Iraqi civilian casualties since we went over there. And by the way, it's 117,000. And I just feel like we're very much sheltered from that. You know, we get the images of Osama bin Laden was shot. Well, not the images, but the headlines. Like, we finally got rid of Osama, you know. But we don't see the human cost. We don't see the enemy combatants. You know, we don't see the villages being destroyed. We don't, like, and some things leak out. Like there was a controversy over troops pissing on corpses. And I just feel like if the U.S. did have a deeper understanding of the scope and violence that we are and have been, you know, putting into these people's lives, like, I think that they would understand, like, hey, wait a second. Okay, there were about 3,000 people that died on 9/11, and it shook our nation. It was painful. So to have 117,000 people die, just civilians, and over a 10-year span, and obviously that's a much smaller country. They don't have, you know, 300 million people like the U.S. does. So it's a larger percentage of the population that's going through that kind of trauma. But instead of, like, saying, hey, you know, we went through this as a nation, you know, feeling attacked, feeling vulnerable, and we don't want you to experience that. You know, instead, like, we have to get involved and shoot people.
So then what's left?
That's a great question. Well, I think that's about all the time we've got for tonight, but it's been great, YouTube.
Peace.